She approached me at a business networking event. Mid-afternoon, the kind of gathering where you spend most of the time having conversations that go nowhere and occasionally find one that doesn't. She introduced herself, said she had been looking for me specifically, that she had found my business through a recommendation. And then she asked me something I wasn't expecting. She asked if my mother was my mother. Username. I said yes. Confused. She smiled, said my mother had been recommending my business to everyone she knew, had been telling people her son had built something remarkable, had apparently been doing this for the better part of 2 years. I stood there for a moment. 2 years. The same 2 years my mother had not asked me a single question about the business. Not once. The same 2 years of silence that had been harder to carry than any argument would have been. I thanked the woman, continued the conversation, took her details, and spent the drive home sitting with what I had just been told about a woman I thought I knew completely, and what she had apparently been doing without telling me. But to understand why that moment landed the way it did, you need to know what the 2 years before it had actually felt like. My mother raised me largely alone. My father was present, but peripheral in the specific way of a man whose attention was directed mostly outward, toward his work, toward the social life that surrounded it, toward the particular self-containment of someone who provides financially without being emotionally available in the way that children need. My mother compensated, not consciously, just by being the person who was actually there, who showed up for the things that required showing up, who paid attention in the sustained daily way that shapes a child's understanding of what it means to be cared for. She was practical above everything else. That is the most accurate word for her. Not cold, not unloving, practical. She approached everything with the specific orientation of someone who had learned early that the world was not reliably kind, and that the appropriate response to that was to build security wherever security could be built. Security was the value that organized everything else for her. Not excitement, not ambition in the conventional sense. Security, stable income, reliable housing, the particular peace of mind that comes from knowing that the basic requirements of life are met and are not at risk. She had built that security through her own work over decades, not through anything dramatic, through the consistent application of a practical intelligence to the opportunities available to her. And she had communicated its importance to me in the specific way that values get communicated from parent to child, not through explicit instruction, through the texture of how she responded to things. What produced pride and what produced worry. What she spoke about with ease and what she spoke about with the particular tightness that signals concern. Security produced ease. Risk produced tightness. The government job had produced ease. When I told her I was taking it, she had nodded with the specific satisfaction of someone who has watched their child make a sensible decision. The job had good pay, reasonable hours, the particular stability of public sector employment, a pension, all the things she associated with a life properly organized. I stayed in it for 6 years, not unhappily exactly, but increasingly with the particular awareness of someone who understands that what they are doing is not what they are supposed to be doing, that the security is real and the satisfaction is not, that the years accumulating in a position that fits the practical requirements, but not the actual shape of the person occupying it, produce a specific quiet cost. The business idea had been developing for years before I acted on it. Not a single moment of inspiration. The gradual clarification of something that had been forming in the background. A specific problem I could see in the market I had been working in. A solution that seemed possible. The growing certainty that if I was ever going to build something, it needed to be now, before the security became the primary reason not to try. I told my mother over dinner, a Sunday dinner, the particular domestic occasion she had maintained throughout my adult life. A fixed point in the week. I had thought about how to tell her, had tried to prepare for the response, had known she would be concerned, had not fully anticipated the form the concern would take. She didn't argue, didn't list the risks, didn't tell me I was making a mistake, She went quiet. The specific quiet of someone who has heard something they don't know how to respond to, who has looked at the information and found no response available that would say what they feel without opening something they aren't ready to open. She asked one practical question: whether I had savings. I said yes. She nodded, and the subject changed. I drove home that evening carrying the weight of the quiet, which was heavier than an argument would have been, because an argument would have meant engagement, would have meant the thing mattered enough to fight about. The quiet meant something different, something that felt like a door closing, or a decision being made about a subject that she had decided was not going to be spoken about. And for 2 years it wasn't. The first few months, I told myself it would change, that she needed time, that once the business started producing visible results, she would engage, that the concern would soften when the evidence arrived that the decision had been sound. I understand now that this was the specific optimism of someone who needed the silence to be temporary, who found the idea that it might be permanent too heavy to carry alongside everything else the early stage of building a business requires. So I set it aside and focused on the work. The early months were the months they always are, more difficult than the planning had suggested, less linear than the preparation had implied. The specific education of someone discovering the distance between understanding a problem and solving it, between identifying a market and reaching it, between knowing what you want to build and building it in a way that produces something real. I worked through it with the focus of someone who had made an irreversible choice and understood that the only direction available was forward. At the Sunday dinners, my mother asked about my life, about how I was sleeping, about whether I was eating properly, about friends and the ordinary texture of daily existence. She did not ask about the business. Not once. Not a casual "how is it going?" Not a practical "have you found clients yet?" Not even the concerned version of the question that would have acknowledged the risk while asking about the progress. Just silence where the subject existed, like a room in a house that everyone knows is there and nobody mentions. I tested the boundary a few times in the early months. Mentioned something about the business in passing, a client I had found, a problem I was working through. She would nod, sometimes make a brief sound of acknowledgement, and the conversation would move, as if what I had said had been received but not retained, filed under the category of things that did not require further engagement. I stopped testing the boundary after about 4 months, because the testing was more painful than the silence. The silence at least had an ambiguity to it. The testing removed the ambiguity and replaced it with the specific confirmation that the subject was closed. I carried the silence in a particular way you carry something heavy when you have decided not to let anyone see the weight. At work, with friends, the business was present and real and consuming in the way that building something from nothing consumes. It required everything available, and I gave it everything available, not from discipline alone, because there was something clarifying about the absence of external validation. When no one you love is watching for you to succeed, when the support you expected is not there, you are required to locate the reason for the work inside the work itself, not in how it will look to someone else, not in the satisfaction of proving something to someone, just in the work. And what you produce when you find that reason inside the work rather than outside, it is different from what you produce when you're building for an audience. More honest, more aligned with what actually matters to you, more yours. I built something real during those 2 years. Not a large business, a genuine one, with clients who are satisfied in the specific way that produces referrals, with a reputation developing in the particular organic way that consistent quality produces reputation, with the early evidence that the problem I had identified was real and the solution I was building for it was working. All of that happening in complete silence from the person whose opinion had mattered most to me since childhood, whose quiet had accompanied every step of the building, whose absence of interest had been the texture of the background against which the 2 years had been lived, until a stranger at a networking event asked me if my mother was my mother, and the silence revealed what it had actually contained. Her name was Margaret. She ran a small consultancy in an adjacent field. Had been in business for about 15 years. The kind of person who's been operating long enough to have a network that runs deep rather than wide. Who knows people properly rather than knowing a large number of people superficially. We talked for about 40 minutes at the event. The kind of conversation that starts with the obligatory professional introductions and gradually becomes something more genuinely interesting. She had specific questions about my work, not the surface questions of someone going through the motions. The questions of someone who understood the field and was genuinely curious about the approach. I answered them with the engagement they deserved. And at some point in the conversation, she said she had actually been looking for me specifically, that she had heard about my business through a recommendation some months earlier, had been meaning to make contact, had kept meaning to and not quite getting to it, and then had arrived at this event and seen my name on the attendee list. I asked who had recommended her. She told me. My mother's name. I asked her to say it again. She repeated it, looked at my expression with mild curiosity, and then asked the question that had produced the expression, whether the woman she named was my mother. I said yes. She said she had thought there might be a connection. Said she had mentioned to my mother once that she was hoping to contact me, and my mother had smiled in a way that suggested something. Then she told me the rest. That my mother had been recommending my business to people she knew for the better part of 2 years. Not casually, specifically, with the particular conviction of someone who believed in what they were recommending, who had identified the right people in her own network and made the introduction, who had spoken about what I had built with a specificity that told the listener she knew it well, even though she had never asked me about it. I stood with that for a moment. The particular experience of information arriving that requires you to completely recalibrate something you thought you understood. I had been reading the silence as absence, as the withdrawal of a parent who had decided her child's choice was too far from what she had hoped for, who had gone quiet because engagement required a validation she wasn't able to give. That reading had been wrong, or incomplete, or both. The silence had not been absence. It had been something else, something I was only now, 2 years later, in a conversation with a stranger at a networking event, beginning to understand. Margaret asked if I was all right. I told her I was, said I was just processing something. She smiled with the understanding of someone who has been in enough conversations to recognize when a person is somewhere else for a moment. We continued talking. I was present in the conversation, but a part of my attention was elsewhere. Running back through 2 years of Sunday dinners, through the silence and what I had understood it to mean, through the specific way my mother had received my brief mentions of the business, the nod, the sound of acknowledgement, the subject changing, which I had read as disinterest, and which now looked different, which now looked like someone who was receiving information, storing it, using it, without letting me know she was doing any of those things. Why? That was the question I was sitting with. Why the silence if she was recommending it to people? Why the absence of any expressed interest if the interest was clearly there? Why not simply say what she was doing? Say she was proud. Say she had been wrong to be silent. Say something that would have made the 2 years different. I didn't have an answer yet. I exchanged details with Margaret. Said I would follow up with her properly. Meant it. She had become someone I wanted to know better. Not just professionally. She had told me something true about my mother. And that was a different kind of reason to stay in contact. I drove home, sat in the car outside my flat for a while, thinking about the phone call I was going to make, and what I was going to say when my mother answered. I didn't call her that evening. I thought about it, sat with the phone in my hand at one point, and then put it down. Not because I didn't want to have a conversation, because I wasn't ready for it. Not in the sense of being emotionally unprepared, in the sense of not yet knowing what I wanted the conversation to be, because there were multiple versions of it available. The version where I told her what Margaret had said, where I asked her directly why she had been recommending the business to people while saying nothing to me, where I let her know what the silence had cost, what 2 years of building without her visible interest had felt like. That version was available, and parts of it were true and deserved to be said. But it also had a quality I wasn't sure I wanted. The quality of an accusation dressed as a revelation. Of making her defend something that had turned out not to be what it appeared. Of arriving at a conversation that was designed to produce an acknowledgement rather than an understanding. And I wasn't sure acknowledgement was what I was looking for. I sat with the question of what I was actually looking for. Not for a day, for several days, because it mattered to get the answer right before I picked up the phone. The Sunday dinner came before I called. The regular occasion. The fixed point. I drove to her house, let myself in, found her in the kitchen in the way I had found her in the kitchen my entire life. The particular domestic efficiency of someone who has been managing a household for decades and for whom the kitchen is the natural center of things. She was making food, told me to sit down, asked about my week. I watched her for a moment before answering. The specific observation of someone who is looking at a familiar person with information they didn't have before. She looked the same, moved the same. The practical intelligence visible in the economy of how she occupied the space. Nothing different on the surface. And underneath something I was now reading differently. Not the absence I had been reading for 2 years. A presence that had been operating in a way I hadn't been able to see. I answered her question about my week. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. I told her about the networking event. Casually, in the tone of someone mentioning something that happened. Said I had met someone interesting. That she had found my business through a recommendation. I paused. Let the pause exist. My mother was at the counter. Her back slightly toward me. Her hands continuing what they had been doing. But something in how she was holding herself changed. A small thing. Just a degree of stillness. That told me she understood exactly where the conversation was going. I said the woman had told me who had recommended her. Another pause. My mother put down what she was holding, turned around, looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, or had seen and not understood until now. Not guilt exactly, not the particular managed expression of someone who has been caught doing something they knew they shouldn't. Something more complicated than that. The expression of someone who had been carrying something private and who has just watched the privacy of it end. Who isn't entirely sure whether that ending is a relief or something else. I looked at her. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then I asked her why. Not accusingly, just a genuine question. Why the silence? Why recommend the business to everyone she knew but never asked me how it was going? Why say nothing to me for 2 years while apparently saying a great deal to other people? She pulled out a chair, sat down across from me. And for the first time in my memory, she looked at me like she was about to say something honest about something difficult, rather than something practical about something manageable. She was quiet for a moment before she spoke. Not the managed quiet of someone constructing a presentation. The genuine quiet of someone finding words for something they have not put into words before. She said she had been afraid. I waited for more. She said that when I told her I was leaving the job, she had felt a specific fear. Not the general fear of a parent watching a child take a risk. Something more particular. The fear of someone who has spent their life building security and who watches someone they love dismantle the security they have built. And who understands that their response to that will matter. That it will shape what happens between them from that point forward. She said she had known her instinct was to say no. To argue. To list the ways it could go wrong, to be the voice of the practical concern she had carried her entire life. And she had understood that if she did that, if she responded with the fear rather than with what she actually wanted, she would be the person who made it harder, who added her weight to the difficulty that was already there, who put her own anxiety between me and the thing I had decided to do. She said she didn't want to be that. Didn't want to be the person whose voice I carried into the work as doubt, whose face I saw when something went wrong, whose silence she knew I would fill with the assumption that she had always predicted failure. She said the only way she knew how to not be that was to say nothing, to remove herself from the equation, to make the space in which I was working free of her particular form of interference. She said it had not been easy, that every Sunday dinner she had wanted to ask had felt the question right there. How is it going? Are you managing? Is it working? Had swallowed it every time, because asking it would have meant being present in the outcome, and being present in the outcome would have meant her fear was present in the outcome, and her fear had no business being anywhere near what I was building. I sat with that for a long moment, tried to take it in properly, not the surface of it, the full shape of it, the particular logic of a practical woman who had decided that the most useful thing she could do was remove herself from a situation entirely, who had understood that her presence in it would be the wrong kind of presence, and who had chosen the absence as a form of respect, not a comfortable respect, not the warm, visible support that I had wanted. A harder version, the specific respect of someone who trusts another person enough to get out of their way. And then I asked about the recommendations. She looked at me, said it like it was the most obvious thing. That, of course, she had been telling people. That she had people in her life who needed exactly what I was offering. That she knew the quality of the work because she had raised the person doing it. That she wasn't going to pretend the business didn't exist to the people she knew. Just to me. Because I was the one who needed the space. They didn't. I found something almost impossible to hold in that. The specific combination of complete withholding in one direction and complete advocacy in the other. The same person, the same period, the same business. Total silence to my face. Total confidence behind my back. I asked her why she hadn't told me. Why she hadn't said at any point in the 2 years that she was recommending it to people. That she believed in it enough to put her name behind it. She said she thought if she told me, it would change the nature of it. That I would start doing the work partly for her approval, partly to justify what she was telling people. That it would become about her understanding of it rather than about the work itself. She said she had wanted me to build it without reference to what she thought, without her presence in the equation in any form, good or bad, so that when it succeeded, the success would be entirely mine, not the outcome of something she had influenced, even positively. I looked at my mother across the kitchen table, the woman who had raised me to value security above all else, who had gone quiet when I dismantled the security she had built for me, and who had spent 2 years quietly telling everyone she knew that her son had built something remarkable, without once telling him she thought so. I didn't know whether to be angry or undone by it. I think I was both, for a moment, and then something else moved through, something that was not quite either of those things. The specific feeling of understanding a person more completely than you had understood them before, of finding something in them that the version you had been carrying for years had not contained, that required space to settle. Before anything else, we sat at that kitchen table for a long time, longer than any previous conversation we had ever had about anything that mattered. Not arguing, not performing, just 2 people talking honestly for the first time about something that had been present between them for years without ever being named. She told me things she had not told me before, about her own working life, about the specific fears that had organized her choices, the moments where she had wanted to take risks and hadn't, where she had stayed in the safe option because the alternative required a certainty about herself she hadn't possessed. She said watching me leave the job had produced 2 simultaneous feelings. The fear I had understood, and something underneath it she had not known how to express. Something that looked like recognition of someone doing the thing she had never done, taking the step she had always stepped back from. She said she had not wanted her fear to become the voice that talked me out of something she had spent her own life wishing she had found the courage for. I listened to that with the specific attention of someone hearing something true about a person for the first time. Not a new person, the same person I had known my entire life, but a fuller version, one that contained things I had not had access to before, because they had not been offered before, because the language for them had not been found before, or because the occasion had not arrived that made the finding necessary. I told her about the 2 years. Not accusingly, honestly, what the silence had felt like, how I had interpreted it, the weight of building something without any visible sign that the person whose opinion mattered most was paying attention, how the absence of interest had sometimes been harder to carry than active disapproval would have been, because disapproval at least contains engagement, contains the acknowledgement that something real is happening. The silence had felt like the business didn't exist. Like I had made a choice so far outside what she could accept that the only available response was to act as though it hadn't happened. She listened to that without defending herself, without the practical reframing she might have applied to a smaller difficulty. Just listened. Let it be what it was. And she said she was sorry, not in the compressed professional way she sometimes managed difficult conversations. Genuinely, with the specific quality of someone who has understood that what they intended and what they produced were not the same thing, that the logic of the choice had been sound in her own thinking, but that the experience of it on the receiving end had been something she had not fully imagined, and should have. I told her I understood, and I did, not completely in the moment of saying it, more completely over the weeks and months that followed, as the conversation settled into me and I found more of its dimensions, the particular distance between what a parent intends and what a child receives, which is one of the oldest distances in human experience, and one of the most difficult to close, because it requires both people to say the true thing, rather than the manageable thing, which is harder than it sounds. Margaret became a real client, and then a genuine professional contact, someone whose perspective I found consistently useful, whose network had depth, and whose introductions were made thoughtfully. She was the thread that had pulled everything into the open, and the relationship that emerged from that pulling was one of the more valuable ones I had built in that period. I found out over the following months how extensive my mother's recommending had been. More people than Margaret, contacts in her professional network, friends from different periods of her life, people from her community who had the right kind of need, all of them having received my mother's specific endorsement, her name behind a recommendation, her conviction in the quality of what I had built, delivered without my knowledge to every person she thought could use it. For 2 years, while she sat across from me at Sunday dinner and said nothing, I asked her once how she had known what to say about the business, since she had never asked me about it. She gave me a look that I recognized from childhood, the look of someone who finds a question slightly insulting. She said she had raised me, that she knew how I worked, how I thought, what I was capable of when I was pointed at something I actually cared about. She said she didn't need to ask me about the business to know it was good. She just needed to know I had built it. I held that for a while. The particular quality of a parent's confidence in a child that exists independent of evidence. That doesn't require proof because it is based on something prior to proof, on knowing the person, on having watched them become who they are across the whole arc of their life. Not just the recent part, the whole thing. That kind of confidence is not the same as approval. It is something older and less conditional. And I had been carrying it without knowing it for 2 years, delivered to strangers on my behalf, while I built in the silence of what I had thought was her doubt. The business continued to grow, partly through the network she had quietly seeded, partly through the ordinary work of building something real. The Sunday dinners continued, but the texture of them changed. Not dramatically, in the small ways that things change when a significant conversation has happened and both people have absorbed what it contained. She started asking about the business. Not every week, but sometimes. Specific questions, the kind that told me she had been paying attention even when she hadn't been asking. I answered them with the same honesty I had brought to the kitchen table conversation, and received them with the understanding of someone who now knew what the asking cost her, what it required her to be present for, what it meant that she had decided to be present for it. My mother is not an easy person to understand. I have been trying to understand her for my entire life, and I think I came closer in that kitchen, on that Sunday afternoon, when she sat down and found words for something she had been carrying for 2 years, than I had in all the years before it. She's practical above everything else. That is still true, But underneath the practical is something else. Something that spent 2 years telling strangers her son had built something remarkable, while staying quiet when the son was in the room, because she trusted him enough to get out of his way, and loved him too much to let him fail without trying to help, in the only way she knew how. That was her version of support, not the version I needed in the moment, but real, and entirely hers, and more than I had understood. For a long time, sometimes the people who believe in you most are the ones who show it in ways you can't see until a stranger tells you what's been happening behind your back. If this story stayed with you, the quiet love in it, the parent who supported you in the only way they knew how, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.